All right, so I want to talk about advice, and it was not only in poker but in life. Like, it was the biggest mistake I made was not knowing where to get my advice from when I was first starting off. And this is kind of like a weird conflict of interest, considering I teach poker and I give you guys advice on this channel. So I'll give you some ways to filter out the things that I say. But first of all, it's something I really didn't understand when I first started playing, is that advice is relative. All right, it's a really relative thing. It's in poker, it's really relative to skill and bankroll. So you can't send somebody a hand all the time and he says this is the right move for you, and it may be the right move plus EV sense, and it may be right, over the course of 1,000 hands or 2,000 hands, but for right then and there, is it the right move? So advice is incredibly relative. It's also relative to your skill level. All right, so what happens is, some players will say, oh no, you have to call on that spot, and you have to call, right? So you got to see a flop with that board. But the problem is that you or the person that you're giving the advice to doesn't understand what to do next. So giving advice is very dangerous in that respect, and that's why, like, in my classes, I'm always giving advice that's specific to each player's skill level. So it's like, yeah, you should call there, but you should probably raise there, because you're going to narrow his range more, and you're really, really struggling post flop. So it's you kind of avoid that situation. So it's very hard to give the proper advice. I mean, there's advice that works a good percentage of the time. Like, narrow your range is pretty standard advice, and it's good because you're reducing the amount of mistakes that you're making. So it's just like standard advice. So but it's really hard to get the best advice, and the best advice is specific. So one of the things is you have to really understand where you're getting your advice from. So I surrounded myself early on with good poker players, just because I was doing it on the forums. I had Sheets and people at Poker X Factor, and my friend Brian, and a bunch of good players that I essentially surrounded myself with, that kind of helped strengthen my game and helped formulate who I am as a poker player. But the problem is, a lot of people, I sit down I'll sit down like at a 1-2 table in Atlantic City, or I'll sit down even at 2-5 or 5-10, and the advice that's going around in tables is so bad. It's wrong. It's not even right. People say, oh, I'm getting odds here. You're not getting the odds here, idiot. You're getting 2-1 on any two cards. Shut up. Fold. I mean, it's bad. It's so bad. And there's advice is so rampant in the poker world. So one of the good things to do is, this is how I say it. If a homeless person who never played poker in his life were to stand behind your table and were to start coaching you, and it's like, you should have folded ace king in that spot, and they told you, you fold ace king in this spot because A, B, C, D, E, and F, and you look at him and go, that makes sense. That actually makes sense for me. That makes perfect. That's good advice. Advice should make sense to you. Just because Phil Ivey or just because Phil Galfin or Phil, Tom Dwan or whatever tells you to play a hand a certain way doesn't mean it has to be played that way. It's relative to what you do. And that's the problem. That's why there's a lot of bad poker players out there, because they essentially read books and try to apply things that aren't right for them. So they are right for the player that wrote the book, and they are right for a good player. But when you write a book, you don't know how the information is going to be interpreted. All you know is, you're right, you're giving good information, but good information is much more specific. So make sure when somebody gives you advice that it makes sense to you. Don't just raise with ace king because they told you to raise with ace king. Raise with ace king because there's a number of variables that make sense to you on why you should do that. And also surround yourself with good players as much as possible, and clearly define what you want. And I talk about this in the goal videos, but clearly define what you want, because it'll be easier to give advice if you can be more real or honest about what you want in terms of your poker career or in terms of your poker hobby or whatever. All right?